Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello. We're going to try and make a start. I want to thank you all for coming here tonight to CISD and SOAS Open Lecture. I'm here tonight with Dr. Daniel Levin, who'll be talking about his experiences in both diplomacy and development. Okay, can everyone still hear me? That's okay, good, excellent. So, he'll be talking, after spending over 20 years in the field of diplomacy and development, he's going to share with us tonight his insights, thoughts, anecdotes, and commentary. So we're going to start off with, he's going to speak for a bit, and then a discussion with myself, and then we're going to be opening it up to the audience, so do feel free to ask any questions. We'll have some roaming mics come round during that session, so don't worry about that. If you are interested in his book, Nothing But a Circus, I believe it'll be on sale afterwards, and he'll be happy if you speak to him at the reception to sign your particular copy while you're here. So, without further ado, I'll pass over to our guest of the night, and I think introduce him, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening, thanks Ash. I will give you a little bit of background beyond what's in the book, just so that some of this makes sense, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is in the intersection of diplomacy and development, and it may be relevant to understand how that came about. And diplomacy, I'm using it as a very broad term, but soon I think you'll understand I'm talking about a very specific type of it. And I'm certainly going to welcome any comments of experiences, people who've had experiences that are different in the formal type of diplomacy or in the less formal one of the nature that I'm going to talk about. So by way of background, I think for me personally, it all started because I grew up in Africa in the 60s. My father was a diplomat in East Africa, and maybe probably got the bug there, but most importantly is when I went to law school, and after I had a chance to figure out where and what I wanted to do, the idea of economic development, financial development in Africa was one that appealed to me. I worked for a large law firm in New York in '92, and when all the changes started occurring, in particular in Southern Africa, in South Africa with Mandela obviously being released and a whole new constitution, that I had a lot of opportunities to take part in that process there. And at the same time in Eastern Europe, I had opportunities more academically to take part in the new constitutions, in particular the Russian constitution after the Soviet Union collapsed. So that was my background in a nutshell. I'm obviously happy to answer questions. I just don't want to bore you too much with that. In the mid-90s, there were increasing mandates, not so much as a lawyer to help these countries with their individual challenges, let's say debt restructurings, privatizations, borrowings, and so on, but increasingly also to help develop new financial markets in countries that either had never really done it, or those that did have financial markets, such as South Africa, with a very deep capital market, where only a fraction of the population had participated in them. So for us, it was a whole new challenge to work essentially as consultants, what we'd consider consultants. There were projects with the World Bank, with USAID, with DFID here also. I'm not going to get into details of all the projects, but we essentially started to be deployed as traditional consultants, kind of the McKinsey, BCG mode, former London Stock Exchange people, being deployed, trying to train young or not so young professionals in various areas, Ministry of Finance officials on legal development, inflation management, things like that. And several projects in the mid-90s, and one in particular in Angola, which I describe in the book, and there's a chapter called Luanda Lessons, were a bit eye-opening to me. And this was a process. It wasn't one, unfortunately not one eureka moment. I would have saved myself a lot of heartache, but it took me, I was a little dense, it took me a few years to figure it out. But where I got the sense that the way we were going about this development just didn't make a lot of sense, where experts would fly in, would talk to a group of local professionals, often in a language they didn't understand, so either required translation or was completely lost. on subject matters that often didn't fit. There were cases in Angola, one that I describe in the book, but I've experienced this many times, where the World Bank in those years was really keen on payment systems, on reducing systemic risks at the time. So that became the topic du jour. Then, obviously 10 years ago, the IMF developed a project on developing financial markets through securitization. Then that became the project du jour. And so we were plugged into those topical contexts, and you really realize quite quickly that this made no sense. In a country like Angola at the time, and we experienced the same thing in Zambia, in Mozambique, in several countries. But we were dealing with a country, we're talking about developing financial markets in a country that had obviously civil war since independence in the 70s, that had a government that was nominally Marxist, with an opposition with Savimbi at the time that was supported by the CIA and the South African regime first, prior to the change in South Africa. But there was no real ground to develop a financial market there, and there was no one really to talk to and on terms that made any sense. And so what we did there is just give our usual talk, our usual spiel, and would sit there and talk about Adam Smith's invisible hand and how prices formulated, and so on and so on. The same thing that we'd given a few weeks earlier in a different country. And I had an experience there that I described where an Angolan took me to see a black market where commodities were bartered and traded, and I realized how sophisticated that market was and how it was operated, that I had very little to teach them on trading. They were doing short sales of commodities. Everything was bartered. And it was so amazing for me to see that. It was just one of those moments where I realized we're really going about this the wrong way. And to cut a long story short, over several country projects, we decided instead of just going out and working as consultants, that we would develop essentially a knowledge platform that was country neutral, and starting with financial reform, financial literacy, capacity building, all the infrastructure, then move to rule of law modules, developing constitutions, training judiciary, identifying qualified judges, and so on, to various areas. And that was the beginning of our approach to development. And the context with democracy, with the diplomacy and where the two intersect is that one of those other revelations that we realized, we were so frustrated with the low, retention or absorption rate of what we were doing, even when we adjusted the platform, is that we realized to some extent we were talking to the wrong people, and either people who were forced to attend these courses or projects, or people who did it because they wanted to come to New York for a week, or wanted to have, delicious croissants at the Ministry of Finance building in a particular capital city. Whatever it was not really effective in terms of measuring how much information was conveyed and how much of it was later implemented. And one of the things we tested, and it worked really well, is to ask to be given at least half, if not more, of the participants among really younger people, either students or even sometimes just high school graduates, and allow them to access to that. And we found that the success rate, and we can discuss maybe later how we define success here, was much, much higher. And the link, the arch to diplomacy here is that, of course, many of the younger we got the people, the more likely they were to be deployed, because they really had a huge know-how advantage if what we were doing was good. Again, way beyond financial development. So, for example, if we were working with a young team on developing a new constitution in a country, and we're really debating proper ways to diffuse executive power, because that often was a problem, an individual that is really engaged in that process is going to be really valuable to the political leadership of that country down the road. So how they're then deployed and how you guarantee their position, again, it's a whole separate discussion, and probably go a little too far. But for us, it really gave us access to young people who, if not themselves were in leadership positions, very often became whisperers or advisors of political leaders or financial leaders in a country or social leaders. It's not necessarily just all in a state house or in a presidency. And for us, this was a real revelation, because it was an interesting diplomatic tool. We got access to information that way that we otherwise didn't have, and we started increasingly to work in Washington, in particular with the State Department, and then later with the White House. And about 10 years ago, I was approached by the Prince of Liechtenstein, who asked to buy our knowledge platform and create a new foundation with the idea that we would expand what we had now to go into many more areas of state governance, to deal with property rights reforms and to deal with criminal justice system reform, and to do it holistically, where you're really giving the young people on the ground not just this academic knowledge, but you're actually giving the tools, the model laws or the transaction guidelines or the psychological evaluation criteria for aspiring judges, whatever that is. Those became really exciting projects in their own right. So that sort of gives you a little bit of background, completes the framework of what I've been up to during those 20 years that cover the span of the book.
Thanks very much. So in your book, you're quite critical of large bureaucracies and their role in development more broadly. Maybe you could speak briefly on sort of the problems you face when dealing with these kind of bureaucracies.
The book, obviously, in order just to sell the book, I had to take the most grotesque examples and have fun with them. They're anonymized, but they're not fictional. And I want to say something because it's really tempting to just, we could make fun of Trump and we can make fun of a lot of things now, and I'm sure we're going to get to that in due course. But before we, it's easy to vilify the United Nations, and I do it in the book in one chapter, but I do want to mention, obviously, and I mean this somewhat respectfully, that within government and within government agencies and ministries, there are some incredibly competent people to work with. The question is always whether some of these bureaucracies have become so large that they're really not functional anymore to fulfill that purpose, whether it's in foreign service and diplomacy or a group like the United Nations, a multinational group. So I'm not just trying to, have fun at the expense of large bureaucracies. And I can recommend, I told myself I'm going to mention this to you, for those of you interested, in the US in particular, Michael Lewis wrote an article that was published in Vanity Fair on the Department of Energy. And I really recommend reading this article because he went in after the Trump administration took over and realized what had happened to, and the Department of Energy, for those who don't know, is responsible for, among other things, for the US nuclear codes, which is something that the Secretary of Energy appointed by Trump didn't know. But the reason it's so fascinating is because he shows the dedication of those people who have been working in a vacuum, sometimes at their own expense, because so many positions hadn't been filled by the new administration. So again, this is not just to rake large bureaucracies over the coal, but because of the work that we did, whether it is with the State Department and AID, let's talk about the US, but we had the same experiences in the UK too. Or whether it is with the United Nations or the World Bank or the IMF, we found that the gap between what these bureaucracies or agencies or institutions could do, given their reach and their budgets, despite all the budget cuts, and the manpower and this considerable ability that resides in them, the gap between that and what they did do was really, in many cases, grotesque. And that's not to belittle, amazing HIV/AIDS initiatives that were done in Africa or whatever. So obviously there are some wonderful initiatives, but in our area, in particular in the area of poverty reduction, financial development, over 20 years, you sort of get sucked into these new cycles. Every 5 years there's a new realignment and new goals that are being set with some new fancy title of how these new initiatives are being named, and then you sort of fall back into the same ineffectiveness. And the story with the United Nations in there was, again, in the years that microfinance was that you couldn't really have a meeting without someone talking about microfinance, without really understanding that microfinance itself had to fit into an economic system too. You can't just plug in the term microfinance and suddenly everyone has access to capital. And I just showed what amazed me in that particular chapter was that these initiatives, when they're formulated and when they're then later implemented, if they're implemented, are never really tested. Something that you would do in any scientific method, if you have a theory or a project, you will test it and then you will refine it and you will verify it and you'll go back and do that, whether it's political theory or whether it's any natural science, doesn't really matter. So to me, that was such a fascinating gap that I tried to get at.
Yeah, I think it's obviously in part of universities is to make sure that these kind of methodologies are sort of provided to our students. But do you, do you find that there is a sort of a gap between the policy process of people you engage with and sort of, as they're coming, most of them are coming out of these institutions, university institutions, there's not engagement with how they advise on policy processes, that sort of skills training, if you like, rather than content.
Yeah, I think that, the larger an institution in a country in that sense, the smaller the part is that a person who starts can really do, with rare exceptions. So part of the frustration that you encounter is that I've seen this, I experienced it myself and also seen it, witnessed it with others, of course, is that if you, let's say, start to work with the World Bank, and not just stick not to one particular country, and you're an economist or you're a political scientist or whatever the expertise is, and you're staffed on a project, the likelihood that you're going to impact policy is extremely remote. Understandable also. The question is simply what happens to these individuals, and in other words, do you just stick it out and wait your 10, 15 years until you have that kind of access, or do you at some point say you have other opportunities? And that, in turn, I think depends a lot on the political climate. And I see it now with this administration in the US a lot. My daughter graduated high school this year, and I saw her and her friends debate, those who were interested in model UN and foreign policy and so on and so on, who were driven to that. Many of them considered a track in diplomacy in the US, and some had applied to Georgetown, has a very good school of diplomacy in the heart of Washington. And of the 6 kids in her grade that had applied to Georgetown, not one of them decided to go there as a result of the changes in climate that you see in Washington. So I think that, to answer your question properly, you can't entirely detach it for what's happening politically. And I think Washington, for those of you who've experienced it, and again, without getting, having too much fun at Trump's expense, I think it's definitely a city that has changed, and you see it in this regard. And one of the professors in the Wall School there actually told me that they really had to go down to 3rd, 4th tier of applications, when in the past they would have had their pick of the litter among kids really interested in diplomacy. So I think you do see that the climate that right now is reigning in a place like Washington really impacts that.
Okay. That's interesting. So maybe you can elaborate more on the sort of the distinctions, perhaps, between the current administration and what you might see as previous administrations. What is the driver of this sort of particular change, do you think? Is it a nature of the agency of the office, or is it perhaps a deeper sort of structural change?
Well, for one, before we get to the office holder and what that really means, I think that one very just practical, if you will, distinction is that you have huge amounts of positions that just haven't been staffed. So there are projects in the State Department and in the Treasury Department that go way beyond domestic policy in the Treasury. For example, you have an agency with quite a bit of power that's administered by the Treasury Department called OFAC, that some of you are probably familiar with, Office of Foreign Assets Control. It's really the agency that oversees sanctions for the moment. So there are others too, but for the most part it falls on OFAC. And it interacts really actively with the Department of Justice and the FBI within the Department of Justice, and it's quite intricate how that works. And sanctions are really complicated. Sanctions against Iran look very different from sanctions against Cuba or against North Korea, so this is quite a sophisticated structure here. And the key people at OFAC just left after the Obama administration. They were not political appointees, but they just left. And so you have now this vacuum when it comes to sanctions, whether for or against, but you have this real vacuum that no one's really willing to move in. Now, obviously, if you're a tactically really clever player, you can take advantage of the vacuum, and that happens too. And it's happened with respect to Iran quite a bit. But you see that in the State Department, of course, most radically, but you see it also in the intelligence community. So the consequences are, because you have a lot of students or 20-year-olds who say, who are attracted both to diplomacy and also to a track within intelligence. In particular, those students who have a technology background and expertise. So the sort of interface of diplomacy and cybersecurity is a really growing industry together with artificial intelligence. And you're seeing now in the intelligence community such a vacuum of key positions that agents in the field are being endangered as a result of that. So it's really realigning how people think, how attractive people think government is. And that we're talking now 10 months of this administration. So just imagine 4 years in if we get there. So without trying to polemicize this, these things do have consequences for how them is. And you see it, you know, in the past, let's say in US-China diplomacy, we used to worry perhaps the wrong things were being negotiated rather than pooling things. There was just individual items that were being negotiated, and maybe that's not the right formula. That was one problem. The second problem was that the wrong people were talking to each other. And the third problem was that you sometimes just didn't have enough talent in a particular area to accomplish something. And so whether it was South China Sea or North Korea or Taiwan or Tibet or Xinjiang or whatever, trade, commerce, currency, whatever the issues were between US and China, now there's a vacuum. There's really no one there negotiating anything. So yes, it gets delegated to an informal level, to some extent to the military, to others, to foundations such as ours, for example. But that's a pretty dangerous vacuum to be in because it gets filled. And the question is, how does it get filled? So when you ask, you know, is it the structure of the agency? The question is, if the power doesn't reside anymore in the executive that way, all the way looking at the president of the White House, where's that power really migrating? Is it migrating to military actors? Is it being privatized? Are technology companies stepping into that? And those are the questions probably that if you're looking at a perspective from a student, a talented student would say, okay, well, what am I going to do for the next 4 years? And where am I really going to, into which basket will I place those eggs?
So, I mean, if you could just talk more perhaps on the nature of sort of personal diplomacy between various leaders. I mean, there's always been a history of presidents conducting personal diplomacy. Is there you see a distinction here that the sort of impersonal nature, the Twitter diplomacy, that kind of, has that affected the sort of the personal relationships that the president can have with other international leaders, do you think?
I mean, I think that, you know, Twitter diplomacy should probably be an oxymoron, right? If it isn't already, let's declare it to be one. I think that, we're talking about a subset of diplomacy here. So however you want to call it, informal, track 3, whatever it is. So if we talk about formal diplomacy, head to state, structured official ones, then you have more working level diplomacy. And if we're talking now about the really informal one where you're trying to get things done, where you're trying to avert a military crisis, where you're trying to, whatever the case may be, if you expose it, and which is what Twitter really does, basically there's no privacy left, it also inflames it usually, but if you just even expose it, you're losing the protection of confidentiality and secrecy and understanding that people can meet without that really leaking. And once you lost that, you just lost that whole category of diplomacy. And you know, it's really strange. For those of you who have followed some of the North Korean, not just escalation, but also how that's gone back and forth. And I was involved in North Korean discussion before with the uncle of the current ruler in North Korea before he was assassinated. And we had our meetings in Beijing, and he was actually essentially betrayed because of a power play in China. In other words, he was trying to figure out, at the time the president was Hu Jintao, and trying to figure out whether there would be an alternative to the current ruler. And those were confidential conversations, but the head of intelligence in China, Zhu, heard about it and told the North Korean ruler, which was the end of his uncle, essentially. And there's a whole debate whether he was devoured by dogs or not, so I'll spare you all the good stuff. But it ended our work at the time radically, right away. But I've followed it and remained in touch with some of my friends there, both in China and then Mongolia, which played a role in it under the last presidency. And for those of talking about Twitter, the US Secretary of State Tillerson made a statement which you have to sort of call fake news, which is that he tried to slow down Trump's statements on North Korea by falsely saying publicly that there were direct and indirect talks between the US and North Korea, which was true, but not true in the sense that there are the same direct and indirect talks that have been going on for the last 20 years with North Korea, but there was nothing, no new initiative that he was involved in had authorized anything like that. He did it for the sake of slowing down some of the vective coming out of the White House. Trump then took something that he obviously did not know was fake news and shot it down. So he basically tweeted immediately that, Tillerson's wasting his time. I don't know if those of you followed this, not that long ago. He's wasting his time, and this is never going to happen, and Rocket Man only understands one language and all that. I'm starting to sound like him already. It's really scary. It's sad how even the word sad, I guess. Okay. Anyhow, and so Tillerson puts out fake information, which Trump then shoots down via Twitter, which, by the way, is a much safer way to do it because you're not really confronted. It's a little bit like when email came and suddenly we used to get these really nasty emails from people. For those of you old enough to be around when email first was developed. And it was basically really gutsy when you can just hit send and you don't have to face the person you're talking to. So Twitter takes that to a nuclear extreme, no pun intended. And so Trump then used Twitter to shoot down what was actually fake news, and he didn't know that, which in turn created an escalation in North Korea. So you have this, it's a comedy of errors, except it's really sad, obviously. And so you come to whether or not we're at the brink of war or not is a topic for another day, but you asked about Twitter. It can only really inflame. I don't really see what good. Stephen Colbert had a great line the other night. I don't know if any of you saw it, but I'll paraphrase it a little bit. He essentially said that we always thought that World War III would be the result of artificial intelligence, and instead it's just going to be the result of natural stupidity. So I take no credit for that. It's his, but it's such a great line. But I think Twitter is essentially a dumbed-down version. So I don't think you can really conduct diplomacy. Trump, clearly there were cases where he was prodded by Twitter. I'll give you an example that I was involved in, not in executing it, but with some of the parties involved. And this has to do with the Gulf, where the whole, obviously many of you are familiar that the succession in Saudi Arabia has essentially three elements. One is the agreement in the House of Saud on who should succeed. This is oversimplifying it in categories. Second one being the consent by the Wahhabi clerics. And the third one being essentially some form of informal thumbs up by the US administration. At least for the last decades, that's been the case. And when the reshifting happened there with Mohammed bin Salman jumping above the first crown prince, he didn't have really a method to get the US consent. And he spoke to his, I think, mentors, fair to say at this point, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, who's really the ruler of the Emirates de facto. And the deal was Mohammed bin Zayed will get him the consent of the Trump administration, the thumbs up for him, and in return, he'd like to have his agreement to go against Qatar, which is what you've seen for the last few months. Now, there are other factors to this, so happy to chat about it, but I know I'm oversimplifying it, but essentially that was the deal. And the way that they got the consent was to tweet at Trump about what a great friend of Jared and Ivanka, Mohammed bin Salman, would be. Literally, there was a tweet on that, and he responded to that tweet, traveling there, giving the full thumbs up. People forgot to mention that Qatar actually, for example, has a major US Air Force base, which is the headquarters for Iraq and Afghanistan missions. So the fact that we're suddenly putting them on our on our bad list, is not exactly maybe the best US policy, but it was too late for that, and triggered initially by a tweet, and it was much too late to fix it. And so then you go into damage control mode, which is really what happened, where the generals really say that when he said that, he didn't mean that, and so on, and Qatar still remains valued. And this is still going on right now, obviously, for those of you following it, in the GCC, in the Gulf. So I think that nothing good really comes of social media by diplomacy, unless your goal is, of course, to accomplish something not good. Then you can be very effective.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me in this situation that it's unique in the sense that often governments, as part of their diplomatic effort, attempt to present a united front on a particular policy issue. But this seems to be an active conflict within the American government, with Tillerson and Mattis and Trump all conducting simultaneous foreign policies and diplomatic endeavors. But in the public eye, is there a sort of, I mean, I mean, obviously it's harmful, as you said, but how, is this a sense of how harmful could this be in the long run to American foreign policy?
I mean, it's one thing to even say you've got Tillerson and you've got Mattis, you have the guy called Mad Dog, who's your voice of reason now. And,
I don't think he likes that name.
yeah, I guess he's earned it, I guess. And Kelly, so basically it's what Bob Corker now called the adult daycare center, essentially. So everyone's really there to take care of that. But that at least still has some kind of a structure. In other words, okay, it's a Secretary of State, it's a Chief of Staff, it's Secretary of Defense. And they come with a structure, they come with a knowledge base, and we can vilify government as much as we want. You have tremendously talented people at State or at Pentagon or at the NSC that still provide information, at least information, so that these individuals are involved. But what happens when suddenly son-in-law Jared is responsible for Middle East peace? And I wish I was joking, but in fact, that's one of his 20 great functions, once he's solved unemployment and the opioid crisis and so on and so on. So Jared is responsible for Middle East peace. Now, what happens here? Jared, even if we were to give him the benefit of the doubt and he is, honorary member of the Men's Health Society and he's just really gets it and he's extremely efficient, obviously know that. Even if you discount that, there's no way that he has the knowledge, the understanding, the institutional capabilities, the awareness of other countries to do anything. Forget Middle East peace. I mean, even if you say, whatever, police shooting in Baltimore, let's start a little less ambitious. How could he ever be effective in that? So when you're transferring authority, and it is real authority because the president transferring, and the president does have authority, to that kind of a level, and then it starts to flow away from there. But of course, now Jared Kushner becomes a target for foreign diplomats. Suddenly, the parties are out of control. They're so great, that he gets invited to. He never thought that would be possible. Because, of course, and people figured it out very quickly. We talked earlier in the seminar about the fact that Mike Pence becomes a target for diplomats, and it's been written about recently. So, of course, they tailor the message to them. So you have the very wholesome person. It's never a woman who goes alone to talk because he doesn't want to find himself alone with a woman in a room. And you're going to drop a few Bible references and that abortion is murder, and you say a few things, then you got Pence on your side. So suddenly you have these players that are easily manipulated, not because they're better or worse than we are, but because they're not really functioning within the institution that's supposed to be functioning. It's really not the vice president's job, let alone the son-in-law of the president. Then you have the question of security briefings. So there was a big debate whether someone like Kushner should even have access to classified information or not. The whole issue of classified information, given what's coming out about the campaign, is drama on its own. But the problem you have is that you spent generations in a political culture to develop things like checks and balances, the concepts of which of the arms of governments really do what, how do they balance each other out, what's the fourth estate's role, what kind of access should the media have, what role should it play. Suddenly all those assumptions are tossed out. If suddenly, a Marine colonel in Iraq is making US policy on Kurdish autonomy, for example, how does that relate to checks and balances? Where is that being discussed in the Congress? Which chamber of all these things that we supposedly have thought about all these years. So it doesn't work anymore. And then you see the ripple effect in development, because now you have just in the US context, and we could talk about the UK, we could talk about other countries, but you suddenly have people who have been talking about helping. Let's say we talked earlier about the DRC, Congo, with upcoming elections. Are they going to be? When are they going to be? So you have USAID officers trying to register voters there together with Soros Foundation, and they're getting questions back saying, why are you exporting a US democratic model? I mean, look at your democracy. You have an electoral college, you have, someone can be president even if there are 3 million votes less, you have, and some gerrymandering, all these things. What about your model is so much worth exporting? So you have that kind of a challenge and a crisis that loops all the way back to that world.
So we should carry a copy of the Federalist Papers with us as we go.
Yeah.
You speak in your book as well about the sort of Chinese approach, sort of development and diplomacy. Do you think you could speak briefly on that and perhaps elaborate, is this sort of dysfunctioning nature of the US system is there seen in China as an opportunity to expand their sort of sphere of influence?
I know there's so many polemics about that, and in the book, for those of you who haven't not familiar with what Ash is referring to, there's a chapter, an experience I had with a high functionary in China, and this is on the heels of having done several really interesting projects in China, including even testing possible multi-party pilot projects. So it's not that I just came at that completely out of the blue, but this official had asked to meet me because they were trying to acquire a US company that had certain technologies. And there's another agency in the US called CFIUS, which is an intergovernmental agency, which essentially is responsible, I think it's administered by the Department of Commerce, but it's intergovernmental, and it's basically responsible for acquisitions of sensitive US companies. So for example, a Chinese state-owned enterprise can't just buy a nuclear weapons manufacturer in the US, as an example. And this came to the fore. I don't know if those of you followed it, when Chinese technology companies, in particular Huawei and ZTE, were very aggressively trying to acquire business, mainly on the router technologies in the US, and Huawei does the router technology in London, by the way. CFIUS shot it down and became a big, big issue between the countries. That wasn't the context of that meeting, but something similar to that. And he was interested in particular in our work in Africa, and he was interested, in addition to the US side, he showed me essentially a grand map of how he had divided up Africa, not the entire continent, but over 30 states. In each state with like a military-style roadmap about what the market was, who the decision makers was, what their vulnerabilities was, all the way down to mistresses and lovers and so on and so on. It was really amazing. And I saw that, and obviously you're not going to run a state-owned enterprise if you don't have the blessing of the party. And in some cases, these people were members of the 30 group, meaning the third, not the Politburo, but the second level. And I saw it essentially, for him, it was his form of development. And he viewed it very differently. He said that the US model, and I don't know if he talked so much about a US model, but essentially the way the Chinese looked at it at the time, and I think still do, is you've got the colonial powers, you've got the British, and you've got the French, and you've got the Belgians with their disasters, and the Spaniards, and so on, that left behind that legacy. Into that jumped the United States. It's very sadly oversimplified and wrong reading of history, but that's how they look at it, with their development model dominating the World Bank and the IMF, where they only will provide funding with conditionality, where those conditions really include things that you cannot really expect people on the ground to be happy about. And if they can't be happy, how can you expect them to be your friends? So that's the thinking. So the Chinese model was, look, we really are going to flood the continent with infrastructure projects. We need the resources, of course, in particular in the ultra-growth years. And in order to do that, we're not going to approach it with conditionality, but we're just going to align our interests. Now, the question is always, when you align interests, whether you do that with legitimate means and non-legitimate means, but they're both aligning the interests. So you can say that in significant cases of bribery are aligning interests. And by the way, no way indicating that China's the only one that bribes its way through Africa or through Southeast Asia or through China. Obviously, no one has a monopoly on corruption. But it redefined how they went about development. In some countries, you saw a backlash against that. Again, I don't want to oversimplify it. It's very, very different. Chinese development in East Africa is really different, let's say, from Zambia. And there was backlash in Zambia. It depends on whether we're talking about mining versus telecom or rail infrastructure, like in Kenya. So I don't want to be silly versus oil and gas. But it's not that different from what the US did. I don't know if, we talked about Rex Tillerson. In 2000, he was a CEO of Exxon, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. And in 2005, just before he became CEO, but he was instrumentally involved, Exxon did oil work in Chad and paid a signing bonus, right? A signing bonus of almost $600 million. And at the time, the total of US aid in 2005 into Chad was $20 million. So if a plane arrives with an ambassador versus Rex Tillerson and they land in Chad, who do you think that President Deby is going to roll out the red carpet to? So I don't know why people think that that form of development is so significantly different. If you're Exxon and you have a $600 million signing bonus, whether it's in Chad or whether it's Angola and so on, I don't know how different that is from the Chinese model of development that gets trashed, and where, again, we talked about OFAC earlier, where OFAC gets really active in it. So I think stereotyping these things is it's fun, but it's a little bit dangerous. But what amazed me in that chapter was sort of the military type discipline. It reminded me, for those of you who have ever worked with Microsoft, for example, when they acquire new markets, the really disciplined, structured implementation of a project is what really amazed me. And that, I think, in the West, we've lost the ability to do anything close to that. Maybe that's for the better, but we certainly don't have it.
Okay, I think we'd like to take the opportunity to open up some questions from the audience. So we have our student ambassador here with a microphone. So if you'd just like to raise a hand, and she'll come along to you.
I'm sorry, I don't see. Oh, there, sorry, okay.
You haven't tackled the relationship, how diplomacy to fail to, rather than sanction, to solve the relationship between the West and Russia. Second, what the United Nations and Western power can tackle the ethnic cleansing in Burma. And third, is democracy effective in promoting human rights and democracy in Africa and Asian third world countries?
Okay, so you all are going to be here. Congratulations, we'll be having breakfast together. So I will answer. Some of it's just my opinion, and then I can tell you what I've experienced myself. I want to make that distinction. So we can have a debate over our opinions, of course, but I personally have had almost no involvement in Burma or Myanmar, so we can talk about it and whether there was an early glorification of what was considered a human rights campaigner at the time, and maybe she didn't deserve quite those accolades vis-a-vis the Muslim minority there. We can get into Burma, but I don't have, other than my opinion, very little to offer you on that and any particular insights. I'm happy to talk about it, but I don't think I am more qualified than anyone else in here. But I want to answer the other two questions a little more extensively. First, the West versus Russia, and I think that I was involved in some parts of that, both in terms of the development in Russia and the constitutional work related to the financial development. I have a chapter in my book in which I write about it extensively, so I don't want to go into it. But I think what happened there was that in the Thatcher-Reagan years, there was an understanding that whether it was some form of Marshall Plan or there would be some kind of an extension to embrace Russia and include it in the West. Maybe it was done out of a sense of gloating, maybe it was done out of a sense of superiority, that our Western capitalist free market systems were so much superior to communist ones which had collapsed. I don't want to get into that and tell you what Thatcher and Reagan at the time thought, but at least there was an understanding that you would embrace. And then came George H.W. Bush Sr. and said, he famously said it, I'm quoting, "To hell with that. We won, they lost." This is his quote, "We will not allow them to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat." That was Bush's statement. And then after him comes Bill Clinton with Madeleine Albright, who was born in Czechoslovakia, who claimed that she was the only one who knew Eastern Europe and she knew how to deal with the communists, which you get a lot, just like you get, whatever. It's always with exilees who've claimed to know their home country a lot better than those on the ground. And she set the policy of NATO expansion to the Russian border. I'm skipping a few years and generations to give you a quick answer. And I think that tone, starting with Bush Sr. to the Clinton years, created a completely adversarial, and this is not to say that Putin is up there for the Mother Teresa Prize. That's not my point. My point is that it immediately set an adversarial stage. There is a very famous meeting that took place with Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright and Sandy Berger, who was National Security Advisor at the time, and Putin, early in his presidency. And Putin, they were talking, and Putin said, look, we will never be able to have a friendly relationship with the West if you are moving NATO to our borders. And ours obviously included Soviet borders. He didn't say just Russian borders, so that's, again, another discussion. Whereas they viewed it as the almost religious obligation of the West to liberate these states in the Warsaw Pact that had been subjugated to that kind of a yoke. Now, when Putin realized that he's not getting anywhere in that meeting, he looked at Clinton and said, look, if that doesn't work for you and you can't stop that, then why don't we allow Russia to be a member of NATO? And that was the moment where Putin stared at the ceiling and Madeleine Albright stared at her shoes and Sandy Berger stared at the window. No one was prepared for that kind of a question. And to me, that was the missed opportunity. And from there on, if you follow NATO policy, and it's not a debate about NATO and stay NATO, not stay NATO, this is just about setting an adversarial tone. And I think that over the years, certainly over the last 18 years, I should say, there were opportunities post-Yeltsin, in Putin's years. There were opportunities to have a more embracing relationship. I'm not putting the blame here on any side. This is much more complex, obviously. And I hope this is not full of polonium or something. I hope I can say this thing. But
we're going for sushi later.
but I think that was an opportunity that was really missed. And in that respect, that blame, if you will, the burden of that would have been on the West to be magnanimous about it. And then the mistakes were made again and again. They were made in Georgia, obviously, where President Saakashvili was egged on by the White House to belittle Putin. He called him Lily Putin and those things. And obviously, we know how that ended for him. And that, to me, opened up a period of more primal policies where, and I'm not saying this is what made someone like President Putin become who he is today, at all, I'm not saying that. But it certainly, in the US-Russian relationship, introduced kind of a primal thing. It's kind of like, in herds of chimpanzees, the most dominant chimpanzee usually runs the herd. It's not the one who's most experienced, who has the most knowledge. What people forget to tell you is how the story doesn't usually end so well for the alpha male chimpanzee in that herd. So that's the part that gets a little bit tricky. And I think that idea of that kind of dominant behavior was unleashed in the US-China relationship with there. So it's the most complete answer I can give you in just a few minutes. And now I would like to go to the third question, just quickly, that you asked, whether, if I understood you correctly, whether diplomacy and development should be in essentially the business of promoting human rights. Is that correct, or am I paraphrasing you incorrectly?
Actually, there are some elements in the West who want to revive the Cold War institution of the Cold War. It is for their interest to raise the tension between Russia and the West, especially the question, the European Union play a role in aggravating the situation in the Ukraine. It will be better for there are people who want to station NATO troops near the frontier of Russia, that is, the Russians are coming to invade Estonia and Lithuania and etc. And there are certain elements, and the question is, it is better for the West and Russia to solve the problem of not only the world problem, and even the question of North Korea and other things. And I think there are people who are interested to raise the tension that, Russia is coming and not. I think the sanction is not really the way to solve. I think negotiation with Russia about the Crimea, the Crimea War, it was actually the island was part of Russia, but Nikita Khrushchev gave it to the Ukraine during the Soviet Union.
But even if we don't legislate the US-Russia relationship, what you're asking, you can ask in any context, which is, what's the point of war if everyone would be much better off negotiating? What's the point of escalating or aggressively dealing with a nation if you can just sit down at a table and talk like reasonable people? And so, we have basically all of human history to prove that for some reason we can't figure that out. What's the point in the last century with all the world wars? I think that it's a little bit hard for me to answer this question. It's a really loaded question, and whether the U.S. should have, whether the U.S. or the West should support Ukrainian independence, and whether Ukraine is parts of Ukraine are part of are Slavic and should be part of Russia. I don't want to get into that because it's going to lead us to a one-on-one discussion on that. But I can tell you from my personal experience that I've been involved in personally that there were attempts also from the West towards Russia over the last 10 years to engage in productive discussions on certain things that were rebuffed from the Russian side too. I think that you cannot really just say, why don't we just sit down and talk if you haven't developed relationships of trust much prior to that. It just doesn't really work. If you say, look, we talked about Congo earlier. Congo, supposed to have elections, Kabila's supposed to be gone. There's a real chance that we're going to just continue the calamities and the millions of deaths that have happened there in the last years. You can say the same thing. Why can't everyone, all the various militia leaders and the various groups, and the very opposition and Kabila sit down and figure out this together, because everyone's just destroying that state, right? And the answer is, first of all, there are always people who do quite well in war. Just like in the Syrian war, there are groups on all sides of that conflict that do extremely well financially and in other respects from it. War is usually pretty good for business for many people, as is escalation, as is the existence of opposing alliances such as Russia and NATO. So I think that I think actually what you consider rational, which is why don't we just rationally all just hold hands and get along, which would be a rational behavior for survival, I think is actually not the rational expectation. Just like Richard Thaler just won the Nobel Prize for Economics because he showed that, in fact, people in financial markets don't behave rationally. And in fact, I think people in politics don't behave rationally, whether it's because of the primitive chimpanzee dominant syndrome or whether it's any other kinds of syndromes. People are really uninformed about the other cultures, including decision makers. So if you want to espouse the idea, let's really have a conversation, let's say about the Ukraine, if you care about that. Let's talk about nuclear disarmament, for example. If you're going to want to engage that way, you have to create a climate of trust between the parties that do that. And there certainly hasn't been that in a long time between Russia and the United States. It's been a long time on all the sides of it. I think it's the most fair answer I can give you without getting our hands too dirty.
Okay, thanks. I think we've got a question down the bottom here.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you a bit more about your knowledge platform and how that's worked and where you've seen successes and where you've had resistance, and yeah, just a bit more on that, really.
Okay. The knowledge platform, the idea of it was that initially development, and still done very often that way, is let's say you have a country that wants to develop a banking market, just to take a financial example right now, or let's say wants to develop a new constitution, to take a non-financial topic. The way it usually works, if it goes through a Bretton Woods type institution like a World Bank or IMF or a local development bank, right, or DBSA in Southern Africa, is that they will say we need this. Usually the development institution hires outside experts. Those outside experts go. And in most cases, this is a little polemic, but it's still in most cases, what they do for the millions that are spent is some platinum-plated diagnostic study. If you're really lucky, then 5% of that study get implemented. But what gets implemented, it's bad enough that it's just a diagnostic project. But what makes it worse is the diagnostic project usually is just a repetition of the last project that a particular individual has. And by the way, there are wonderful studies, including by psychologists at Princeton and at Penn University of Pennsylvania, about the fact that how much these things just cannibalize each other. Now we're just repeating the last project. So when we did our initial projects, financial literacy, poverty reduction, so on, we said that you cannot really expect something that just worked or didn't work in Malaysia to be implemented in Zimbabwe, right, for argument's sake. There's so little in common. It's not just about language and culture and civil law, common law, whatever it is. It's just that you really can't transport these things. So what we did is essentially develop a platform that was neutral to that. So if we had a model constitution, every freedom of religion would have 20 different options. It will be freedom of religion, from religion, no such provision, delegating it to a law level versus constitution. This is a legal issue. But we would put it all in there, and then the platform included also the implementation guidelines for the teams that had to do it. So you'd say, okay, we have 5 people responsible for briefing Parliament on a new constitution. Who does what for the next 200 days so that it actually sees the light of day? You even had to have the press release for the Minister of Justice because he or she really want to look good when they actually brief the media. So you have to have that press release ready for them, and they have to have a PowerPoint for them because sometimes you can't expect them to read 2 paragraphs. So you have to do it in buzzwords. Right? And by the way, I could apply this to the US government the same way. So you get to all these things, and so, but we had to take that human factor into account to do it, and that was the idea of the platform. So you don't only have the deliverable, the academic training, but also define as the deliverable all the other parts that had to be implemented. That was one, and then the second part was you cannot really do development in most areas if you're not willing to take others into account. We talked earlier with a few students about property rights, a huge issue worldwide, the absence of formalized property rights. Hernando de Soto, I mentioned him to the students, the former Peruvian finance minister, wrote a very interesting book called Mystery of Capital on that. But the absence of functioning property registries, measuring properties, registering the fact that you have in some countries, 300 steps you have to go through. It can take you 10 years to register your shack that's been in family ownership and prove possession and so on. People don't register it. As a result, they don't have their property to use for, let's say, borrowing and to use it to start a business. We're talking about small business. Those are real tragedies, and the loss of capital and well-being to an economy and society are huge. But you cannot go and just say, okay, Indonesia, here's your new property rights registry. It doesn't really work because they're going to say, well, I'm not registering my house if it means you're going to tax me on my property, because I'm not going to pay tax if I don't have a sewage system that works, or if I don't have schools that my kids can go to, or a hospital that works. So you immediately get to the limits of what you can really do. So our goal, and the reason now we try to do this with the foundation, is to expand the areas, right? Then you cannot really do it if you don't have a good tax system. But again, if you're going to do a tax system, you have to have a whole broad range of tax ideology too. You can't just say low tax, high havens. It has to be a little more sophisticated, direct, indirect, estate taxes. Is it fair? Is it not fair? Should the next generation really inherit wealth? Not. You have to allow the teams on the ground to have that active debate. And what I found, and it sounds so silly, but it really happens in development, just like you see it in diplomacy too, is that there's a bizarre sort of inbred hubris of the person doing the developing. It's just the way it works. It's really hard to avoid. I'm as guilty of that as others are. It's sometimes a language advantage, sometimes it's just a know-how advantage, but it's sometimes minuscule. That was the Angola story, to show that maybe it's not really an advantage. And to overcome that, it's really hard. And until you overcome that, or we overcome that, it's really hard to have intelligent development in that sense.
Okay, we'll take a couple of last questions. Is that a gentleman over there? Do you want to just take a couple in a row?
I've got a question concerning social media. You said that nothing good comes out of social media. And I believe that there are a couple of people who would disagree with that, especially talking about public diplomacy. And I'm just wondering if you maybe see opportunities of social media, maybe not that much in government-to-government talks, but in government-to-foreign population talks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry if I misstated that. We should run the tape. But I think that what I specifically was answering Ash's question, I think that diplomacy in particular, track 3 or more behind-the-scenes diplomacy is an anathema to social media because you're just too exposed. In other words, either what you're discussing is so irrelevant that you might as well just post it on Instagram, in which case why bother, or it really has such substance, in which case it needs to allow to percolate in an environment of trust for a certain amount of time. And therefore, being exposed to that kind of bright, really bright, shrill light, I think is bad for it. But do I think that social media can play a role? Yeah, in development, for example, in education development. I think that we were asked 20 years ago to do a project in Indonesia, which we had to decline because we didn't have the technology to do distance learning. Same thing in the South Pacific. We also had to decline. And believe me, everyone was lining up to go to the South Pacific to do that project. And we just couldn't do it because we didn't have the technology to do that. When we're talking about, now you can deliver that, whether it's whatever, using Facebook or whatever it is, you have so many platforms you can do this with, and you can do it extremely cheaply too. So I think social media has a huge role there, but the intersection with diplomacy and with politics are tricky. And I think you even see, I don't know if you were referencing, those who will disagree, someone like Zuckerberg, obviously, when post-election, when people were saying that Russia manipulated the election using Facebook, buying advertisements, and he just, first of all, really said that wasn't really possible. And after the pushback, there's, I think, some awareness now that social media has to, and Facebook's really different again from Instagram or from Twitter, any of that. So the Twitter issue is just the shrillness of it. Facebook's a little different, and it's a little more insidious in that sense, and requires some thought as to what you are. You're not just a public platform. You're a platform that can be used very effectively for very little money. You have to be aware of that. So I think you'll see, and social media is perhaps too broad a term to pack everything in the same way. Companies like Cambridge Analytica and others who work behind the scenes very aggressively and very intelligently in a Machiavellian way with social media, the combination of artificial intelligence and social media to effectively campaign, for example, which was effective in the US, was very effective in Kenya now. They worked with the president, with the incumbent, I should say, in Kenya on that. So you see the outcomes of these things, the ability to target particular voters in the US, for example, in the 3 swing states, 70,000 voters in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, and in Michigan made the difference of the US election. Essentially 70,000 voters, and they were identified half a year before the election. And they were targeted with social media. And by the way, targeted primarily not to vote. So it's not even about mobilization, it's really about discouraging. So it gives you a whole different sense of proportion. I think if anything, we're at the infancy of that. How do we really deal with it? So my response was really just on diplomacy, which is, I think, generally diplomacy is more meaningful. You'll always have your photo ops, but if you're trying to accomplish something, you want to be able to do it without it being blared out. And so social media is usually not very helpful for that. I'm not saying technology isn't, right? Algorithm technology, it's made it much easier to have confidential conversations far away. But social media, I think, is a little bit tricky now. I hope I've answered it comprehensively.
Okay, so we'll take 2 last questions. A chap in the blue t-shirt there, and then the young lady there on the corner.
Hi, I've got 2 questions. The first one is, you touched on the work of Daniel Kahneman and stuff for which they won the Nobel Prize for. And I just wondered whether you have any personal examples of that understanding of the kind of irrationality of humans and how you can, well, they applied it to economics, but you can apply it to diplomacy. And the second question, which you kind of touched upon but didn't go into, is about what are your metrics of success in the field. So you're talking about tailoring your programs to particular countries. How do you assess whether those are effective? So what are your metrics?
Okay, should we take both questions then, so we can, do you want to take?
Hi, I'm just wondering, in the age of sort of WikiLeaks and hackers, how that's affecting sort of what are meant to be private diplomatic conversations. Like, for example, in regards to Ukraine, the leaked conversations between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, that kind of, she's outlining essentially who she wants to become the new president of Ukraine and picking through like 4 different options, and how that got leaked and was sort of a pretty big embarrassment for US.
Okay. All right, so 3 different questions. I'll try to do them justice quickly. The first one with, you asked about the work of Danny Kahneman, and there are many angles to that, and they're very useful angles, and the insights that he has from, for example, irrational economic behavior for us is really useful. One example that I've used before, he talks about noise and bias a lot, and it impacts us too. For example, when we try to develop modules for the identification of qualified judges, and you're trying to figure out who has the temperament and the disposition to be a good judge. How do you test that? And you're trying to figure out judges. So usually the answer people say is a judge should be someone who can work independently. It's that word independent, but it doesn't really mean much. It's treated as a soft skill when in fact independence should not be a structure, not an agency issue. In other words, independence should be the framework. It should be someone who should be allowed to work without direction, political direction or economic direction. He identifies, he's really helpful in understanding what are the characteristics that a person can work by shutting out noise, right? But one element that we were able to use and integrate and was very important to us, he talks about something called happy endings. I've spoken about this before. It's the famous colonoscopy. That's the first test that he did, so forgive me for this example. I don't know why we always end up there. But essentially, he figured out in the years where colonoscopies were even more unpleasant than they are today, for those of you who are my age or older who have experienced it, it's essentially, it's not a really fun experience. You're obviously sedated during that. And he tested essentially that if you left the tube inserted a little longer than had to be, but not fully inserted, the patient would experience the entire colonoscopy as less unpleasant, which was really critical because the doctors were frustrated that a person who had done a colonoscopy had experienced it, such an unpleasant experience, they would never come back. And it was devastating in the fight against colon cancer. So all joking aside, it was actually his insights were invaluable to the medical industry for that, because he figured out, said, look, if you make the end of that unpleasant experience just a little less unpleasant, the person's much more likely, but it's still unpleasant, right? So it's not rational. Rational is, would you rather have 10 unpleasant minutes plus 2 less unpleasant minutes, but still unpleasant, or would you rather have just 10 unpleasant minutes? Chances are the rational answer is just 10. So, and he refined this concept of happy ending. It's really brilliant, actually, when you think about it, which has a lot to do with irrational economic thinking too. But if you take it into diplomacy, and you take the concept of happy endings, the idea, because diplomacy happens through rounds. It's not like you just march into a room and say, here's a solution, everyone go home now. It happens through rounds, through years sometimes. And if you learn to keep the end, to have a happy ending to the end of a session of each round, it really is a tool that's helpful. And by the way, this is not just true for diplomacy. If you're teaching, if you have kids and you're trying to get them to do something that, or a spouse, you know, I've had this strategy deployed against me very successfully. So I think that these were the kind of insights that for us were extremely, extremely effective. Okay, you had the second question? Sorry. Oh, how do we measure success was the second question, right? So it really depends. If you're doing, let's say, a constitutional reform that has, in the context of an election, you can measure success by the amount of people that register and vote. You can also measure success by the level of knowledge that people have when they vote, too. And you can measure that, and you can do it, but we talked about technology earlier. It's much, much easier to do that today. You can do, with WhatsApp, just a game that people, you know, just in the form of a game, just like you had investment games to educate children on saving and investing, you can have games that you send around on WhatsApp to ask simple political questions. What's the name of the candidate? Do you know anything about the parties and so on? And so you can measure success of political inclusion. You can measure success of poverty reductions. If you have countries where people just keep their savings, in a country with hyperinflation, and people keep their savings under the mattress and don't understand why their savings are worth less at the end of the month than in the beginning, and you can teach about indexed investing, for example, just as an argument's sake, right? Then you've accomplished a lot. And you can measure that by how many people open those bank accounts. So we built into the modules those kinds of milestones to measure it, okay? And then, of course, you have those who game the measurements and obviously get around it and all that. So you have to game the gamers, essentially. So that's the fun part. And then you asked the question about, you know, if you take your question beyond the Ukrainian example with Victoria's mishap, I think that the whole era of WikiLeaks generally, and the fact that so many things now so many dispatches get public, here's the way I can answer it best. You know, in the US, there was no real law against market manipulation in financial markets. And there was a rule, so-called Rule 10b-5 in the US statutes that talked about that. And there was a defense against that. So in other words, if I am a director of a company and my company goes bankrupt, am I liable or not liable? I know this sounds a little far-fetched. I'll get there, and give me 60 seconds. And am I liable? Am I going to be sued by shareholders or by investors if my company's bankrupt? So I have what is called a due diligence defense. In other words, if I can show that I was duly diligent in the exercise of my duties, then I have a defense against that. I don't have strict liability. So what happened? There was a court case that came out. It's a famous case in the 70s that said a director of a company cannot claim to be duly diligent if he or she did not read the minutes of a board meeting that he or she attended. It's just one of the standards. So what happened as a consequence of this law, of this case? Board meeting minutes became one paragraph. What used to be 20 pages, they've dumbed it down to one paragraph so that no one could claim they didn't read it because no one wanted to read 20 pages. So I'm taking this as an analogy to what happens in diplomacy. Because of the prevalence of leaks, also because it's so technology-driven today with emails, and it's amazing how many not just diplomats, but how many people still use unsecured networks and emails and so on, right? I mean, just get on a plane and go there. But it's because of the fact that so much leaks, I think that what you're seeing is a dilution of the sensitive nature of what ultimately gets this. Yes, you still have those where you sort of think Darwin got that wrong, right? But you still have those who still do that and still get caught and lose their career over that. But for the most part, you see sort of a dumbing down of these kinds of cables and briefings. The same thing with diplomatic dispatches, the same way. Very little gets discussed that way, and we're kind of going back to pouches and hard copies.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we'll draw our evening to a conclusion here. I would just like to say, if you do get a chance to read Daniel's book, I found it very engaging and well written, so I recommend you do the same. There's a reception upstairs afterwards, and I'm sure we can all continue this conversation. I think we should just thank our speaker tonight and